Hi, everyone. I'm Sheila Horvitz, and this is Talk Back. And during this time, we've been having special programs through Facebook Live, Channel 14, Norwich. We have the shows on live, and then they're on the website of Facebook Live, Facebook Norwich. And then you can watch them on Comcast channels 14 or 1070 in the Norwich Comcast area, which includes Colchester and many of the surrounding towns to Norwich. And today I have a very special guest, our Congressman Joe Courtney of the 2nd Congressional District. And he's here waiting to go back to Congress next week to do more good stuff, hopefully for us. Hi, Joe. Good to see you today.
Hi, Sheila. Yep, this is a special show. By the way, I like the new intro. That's really
well, thank you. Thank
nice.
you very much. Thank you so much. And you've been in Congress for how many terms now? 3 or 4?
In my 7th term right now.
7th term. Oh my God.
Yeah.
That's right. 2006. That was your first election. Oh my goodness. I remember. Yeah. And did you ever think that we would be living through a period like this?
Never. I mean, I was actually talking to Chris Dodd a few days ago, and we thought we'd seen it all, but this is obviously takes the prize in terms of just an event that is forced the country to really change its behavior on a dime. I mean, when you think about it, how quickly the shelter at home was implemented, and and I actually overall still give kudos to people that they really did respond and do the right thing in terms of following public health directives. I mean, as sometimes confusing and fragmented as it's been, I actually think by and large people have really stepped up in a very impressive way.
Okay. Well, I know it all started with the stay-at-home here in Connecticut. It was in March, about the middle of March.
Right.
And lots of people, of course, we're going to be looking back at this and having many meetings and investigations and studies about how this all came about. But many of us, as we read, think that we were a little bit late. Not that our Governor Lamont isn't doing a wonderful job at this point, but we heard from Donna Shalala, who is one of your colleagues in Congress from Florida now, and she used to be the head of Health and Human Services in the Clinton administration years ago. And she said that she remembers getting warnings, that Congress got warnings sometime in the past year or so, and they weren't heeded. What do you have to say about that? How soon was Congress aware that this could be a pandemic that could affect the whole country?
So, again, just in terms of, well, by the way, Donna and I served together on the Education and Labor Committee, and, what an incredible asset to the country and to the Congress with her background, as you point out. We started getting some briefings, bipartisan briefings in the Visitor Center, classified probably starting in February. And to be honest with you, it was pretty happy talk sort of events, where, we got things under control, the numbers are just tiny compared to, anything that's happening over in Asia. Again, really nothing to see here sort of thing. And if you look at Trump's first request for emergency appropriations in early March, actually it was the last week of February, early March, he asked for about $1 billion in new money, which, obviously we're at a place now where we've appropriated trillions in terms of trying to respond to this situation. But it just showed how, much they were downplaying the risk. Again, if you play back, the president's comments about his, interaction with Premier Xi or President Xi in China, he's doing a great job. We're just, not going to see anything happen here. It's going to disappear magically. It's a hoax. I mean, all of these very, at best, confusing messages, and in some instances, misleading messages that were coming out of the White House. And again, that was sort of reflected in terms of the Department of Health and Human Services Secretary Azar, the folks, even at CDC, who were really just playing down and telling Congress, we don't really need you to do anything differently, which we know now is just appallingly.
Okay, so Joe, so basically you're saying that we all heard the public messages from Trump. It's a hoax. It's
Right.
nothing. We only have a few cases. It's going away. China's doing a great job to stop it, which of course goes against now everybody
Right.
trying to pin the blame on China, which he's trying to do in retrospect. But you're saying that, and not just that, that those words that the president made were reflected in the information that was sent up to the Congress, that it infected the whole body of the administration of the people that work underneath the White House. Is that right?
Correct. I mean, we did have, again, officials that showed up at the CBC auditorium to brief us. And as I said, if you listened today to the way they were characterizing this, it was just something that was very manageable and wasn't going to, again, require much in terms of any action by Congress. And basically, we got this thing under control. And if you look at what the request that came over from the White House at the end of February, which by then, this pandemic was 2 months, in play. The fact is it was just peanuts and minuscule, and there was no discussion about activating the Defense Production Act, which we know now should have been deployed in terms of the shocking shortages of protective personal equipment, ventilators, etc. And in every instance, that the Congress, particularly the House, took whatever request that the president sent over and increased it by factors of 4 and 10 and hundreds, both in early March, middle of March when we passed the Family First bill, and then the CARES Act at the end of March, which was a $2 trillion measure. Again, in every instance, we were sort of scrambling to get the country better positioned to deal with the human costs, the healthcare challenges, and as well as the economic ripple effect.
Yeah. So that brings up an interesting point that I've been thinking about, that our country is based in a federalist system. We have 50 states. The governors have certain kinds of authority. But we also have a federal government that in times of crisis, in times of war, does take a leadership role. So when you're in a war, you don't have a general from Massachusetts telling the general from DC what to do, right? I want you to speak to that question, the idea that we need a complete national plan, maybe even a global plan for the whole world that I know most American presidents would be taking the lead at. And so describe that tension between having 50 states doing their own thing, getting their own supplies, getting their own tests, getting their own equipment, fighting with other states, fighting with the federal government over contracts for things, versus what you do when you need total and complete leadership from DC to operate this war against this virus. Talk about that.
Well, I mean, again, I think you really nicely described the sort of structure of our country responding to an emergency, which again, we've done, through FEMA and hurricanes and, other disaster scenarios. And frankly, also some, pandemic situations, Ebola under the Obama administration. And there's no question, when you talk about delivery of healthcare, when you talk about emergency services, all of that flows through at the local level. Through state government, through local agencies, through our healthcare and hospital system, that is not controlled in Washington, by that much to that degree. But what the federal government provides is, number one, the overarching capacity to finance the cost of that. I mean, as Chairman Powell from the Federal Reserve pointed out in 60 Minutes a couple of days ago, I mean, the federal government's capacity to borrow money at a far more efficiently and cheaply than state governments or local governments' ability to finance these very expensive undertakings screamed out for action by the federal government. And he, again, has done a good job in terms of monetary policy. Again, he has been positive about Congress's response on the fiscal side with the programs and tax policies that we've issued. But he's also said we need to do more. And that's why this HEROES Act, I think, is so necessary. And again, this guy's a conservative Republican banker who was a Trump appointee. But also, as you point out, you also need to have a plan that's implemented at the federal level. And just to use it as an example, we know now that a testing strategy is key to safe reopening of the economy. South Korea, Germany, other countries that again are further along in terms of reopening. All of it was based around having a national testing strategy. Again, in the last bill that we passed at the end of April, we put in about $25 billion, again, at the Democrats' insistence, to get a testing program up and running. That money is flowing out to the states. I mean, there's no question that's where the boots on the ground are going to be implemented, even with our state, Army National Guard. But we need to have a consistent plan in terms of, what is the criteria for testing in terms of who gets it, what's going to be the systems that are going to be used in terms of getting test results back, feeding it into a national database, because this virus does not stop at state borders. I mean, it travels across state borders. We've seen that, how it's migrated out of New York City into other parts of the Northeast. And we also are seeing it now in the Midwest and even down in Texas and down south. And that's why as you point out, Sheila, you need to have an overarching national policy. This president has willfully and intentionally refused to take on that task. When we did the testing package, the $25 billion I mentioned earlier there, we put in language in the proposal to have an overarching policy, just like you described. The White House flat out refused to accept that language to be included. We put that language back in the HEROES Act, which passed last Friday night, because again, that's the only way we safely get this country reopened. And hopefully, when the time comes, a vaccine is available, which again, the national government is financing that effort, which is being implemented by research universities and even pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer's here locally. But again, it has to come with a national coherent plan about, when we get down to the final vaccine that is actually deemed to be the most effective and safe, then it's going to be implemented nationally really at the federal level. You can't have every governor pick and choose which vaccine they're going to use in Michigan versus Connecticut versus California. I mean, that's crazy. And
right.
And that's just been missing. From this administration, is just stepping up and doing, what Harry Truman says, the buck stops here. It's your decision to deal with a national crisis like this.
So we lost ground with the testing because initially the tests weren't, the CDC had some problems with the tests they had. I read that the World Health Organization had tests that they could have given us, but Trump insisted that we start over again with American companies. And we lost a lot of ground there. That has made a big difference, maybe, in the number of deaths. And then, of course, you mentioned the Defense Production Act, which I know is a federal statute where the president can take control over certain industries and say, you've got to make these tests, you've got to make these swabs, you're going to do the protective equipment for the hospitals, right? And he didn't make use of that particular law, which he could have, and that could have saved lives too.
Correct. I mean, time is the enemy, when you're talking about getting critical supplies. Again, there was a story in the paper today about a young woman who worked at L&M Hospital who, are really the real heroes who have been in direct contact with COVID-19 patients and lost her life. And again, it happened at a time where L&M, like at many other hospitals, not picking on them per se, it's just, they were all scrambling for equipment, which, again, we had offshored over decades, in terms of the production of this. And but we did have, textile mills. We did have other companies that the Defense Production Act would have empowered the president to redirect resources. And really, the warning flags were up in January in terms of the shortages and the way an airborne pathogen like the coronavirus migrates. I mean, you've got to have that equipment. And again, it took this president way too long, really, on again, off again, in terms of the defense production orders that have come out. Nobody's in charge. I mean, is it FEMA? Is it HHS? Is it Department of Defense? Again, the HEROES Act puts into place a structure in terms of, this just enraging, infuriating problem of access to personal protective gear. The one place where he really did step forward was on meat production and meat packing. I mean, he invoked the Defense Production Act the minute he heard there was going to be a problem with meat supply. And frankly, he did it in a way that put those workers in those plants at very high risk, because it's basically an order from the federal government that you got to show up for work. Even though, again, these guys didn't have adequate equipment, they weren't using social pacing, the speed of the line in terms of the meat packing production. Again, we've had hearings on this on the Education and Labor Committee, which deals with OSHA. Again, a 9/11 commission, as you pointed out at the outset, Sheila, is so important in terms of this whole event. I mean, there are so many issues in terms of, again, the way this country, sort of communicated with the World Health Organization and, ignored, like you point out, the test opportunity, at the same time misrepresenting certain medical facts, which, obviously hurt us in terms of a timely response. Again, the whole question of just critical supplies in this country, we've got to go back and really look at a Make it in America system in terms of what we know is not going to be a one-off. I mean, the pandemic threat is something that is now something that most experts realize is just not going to be, just this sort of once in a black swan event. It's going to be something that we really have to be ready for.
Right. So a couple of points from what you said. Yeah, those meat plant workers, they were getting the viruses in big numbers and infecting people in those states, Iowa, and what was the other state? The Dakotas. Yeah, I mean, the other thing about that is if your plant is open and you don't want to go to work, you may not be eligible for the unemployment assistance, right? That's in the CARES bill, because you're commandeered to go to work, right?
Yes. I mean, again, the states are all sort of all over the place in terms of how they're treating that issue in terms of eligibility for unemployment. Connecticut, I mean, I think has actually been showing more willingness to recognize that people retain their eligibility, particularly if they've been diagnosed or have a positive case or are in quarantine or a doctor's letter that they're symptomatic. So that's certainly the case. But it really, what's really bad, and with your legal background, this is that Mitch McConnell is now pushing for liability protection for businesses when people are coming back to work, and to a degree, there's some logic to this because it is such a novel event, and people can't control it as much as they would like to. But if you're gonna do that, or even on a limited basis, which is, in my opinion, the only justified way, and again, very limited, you've got to have some kind of OSHA rules about just what is best practices to deal with this, and you've got to give workplaces access to PPE. This morning, my office dropped off 500 surgical masks at Wyndham Chamber of Commerce and 500 up in Killingly at the Northeast Corner Chamber of Commerce. Again, we had a person who donated them and showed up at our office with 1,000 masks. These business owners, I mean, they were like diving at it because they want to have the help so that their staff and maybe even their customers, have face covering if they're going to safely open up. And and to say, well, we're not going to, no one's going to be held liable, for infection as a result of, being forced to go to work. But at the same time, you're not going to give people protections in terms of social distancing and PPE. I mean, that is putting workers in a totally impossible position.
Right. So we need rules about that. And then we need to have more streamlining and more organization about the testing. So just talking about Connecticut. So I learned yesterday from a friend, hey, you can go to Bacchus Hospital now and you can sit in your car and you can get a test. And now maybe CVS, at some CVSs, you can get a test, but you have to make an application. And if you live in another state, you can't get a test unless you get a prescription, and you used to need a prescription. I find that there's just a catch-all of so many different ways, and we need testing because we need to know, okay, am I negative? So maybe I can go out now. Maybe I can visit my grandchildren who also may be negative. I mean, where do we stand on testing now? Governor Lamont said that we're doing okay, 45,000 a week tests. Is that enough? And how is the word getting to the public that you should be going and getting a test?
So the best information is that, we've certainly made progress compared to a month ago or 6 weeks ago with those numbers that the governor cited. But, we need to be at a much higher level. And again, as I mentioned earlier, if you look at the countries that have been the most successful in terms of reopening, I mean, in South Korea, they're back playing baseball again, and you can see the pictures on TV where city life is sort of starting to return to normal. They have universal, completely accessible, just frequent access to testing, and we're not there yet. I mean, again, the HEROES Act, which passed on last Friday, expanded the financial commitment in terms of the testing that was in the supplemental bill at the end of April, because $25 billion for testing is just not enough for a country with over 300 whatever it is. We're up to close to 320 million people. That obviously is a big undertaking. We also put in there provisions so that there is absolutely no out-of-pocket costs that will be incurred for anybody's, through their insurance plan, through their Medicare, through their Medicaid, through their VA, whatever. We want no barriers in place in terms of making sure that people get tested, and again, put in resources to make sure that's the case. And obviously, we need to have the tools of the executive branch, whether it's CDC, FDA, in terms of certifying tests that are working and actually reliable, as well as HHS in the driver's seat in terms of coordinating a program that has to be national in scope. And so it's still a work in progress. I mean, I guess that's the short answer.
Well, let's talk about that HEROES Act, because I know the Democrats want that passed very much, and already it's gotten resistance. So we had the two CARES Acts, we had the two sections already, and we have the unemployment insurance and other benefits through the CARES Act for small businesses and so forth. What is the HEROES Act mainly trying to do, and why are you getting opposition from Mitch McConnell and from the Republicans, and even, I guess, the president? He's got to sign a bill that you pass, can't just pass it without the Senate going along with it and then the White House signing it. So tell us more about the purpose of the HEROES Act.
So the purpose of the HEROES Act, I think, is really in direct response to what I think Chairman Powell from the Federal Reserve said, which is that we're looking at a situation right now where unemployment has not peaked. We're at roughly between 15 and 20% unemployment. He was predicting 25% when it peaks. That the recovery is not going to be just a flip of the switch. Again, there will be movement back to work, that will take the peak down, hopefully in the very near future. But projections out by both the Federal Reserve and the Congressional Budget Office that we're still looking at double-digit employment at the end of 2021, which is really, that is as bad as anything we saw in 2008 and 2009. So what the chairman was saying is that, that screams out that we need more fiscal policy. The biggest sort of piece of the bill is state and local funding to make sure that the lights stay on. Again, state government has been taking a huge bath in terms of loss of sales tax revenue. Nobody's out shopping. No one's out buying gas. No one's out buying hardly anything except food at a time like this, which we don't tax, and that's good. Income tax receipts are way down. The National Governors Association came forward, bipartisan, Republican and Democrat. They said we need $500 billion spread out over 2 years. That's what the bill responded to. We also had a portion of money, roughly about $400 billion for local government. By the way, for Eastern Connecticut, it also allocates a specific amount for communities 50,000 or less, which basically defines Eastern Connecticut. They always the smaller communities in past, anti-recession packages always kind of get the crumbs. There will be direct funding based on population for smaller communities that are out there right now. And again, it's spread out over 2 years so that there will be an ability to plan for state and local officials to make sure that they can, fully fund key positions. There's some funding for education, because again, our school systems have gone through tremendous stress with remote learning, the digital divide for families with kids who don't have access to good computers. Again, that's addressed in this package. We also put in money for COBRA subsidy, which you and I were talking off camera. When someone gets laid off, and you know this from your practice family law, or goes through a life event where their policy, where their health coverage changes, there's COBRA extension that you can get, but it's very expensive. This bill provides 100% COBRA subsidy so that those folks at Foxwoods who are about to get a full layoff on June 1st and they're going to lose their health benefits will be able to maintain their health coverage. It sets up a thing called the HEROES Fund, which basically recognizes that all those workers who could not collect the enhanced unemployment benefit because they were deemed essential, and that is particularly, the folks who have been in the hospitals, our police, fire, first responders, people working in grocery stores, people working in the meat packing plants, which we discussed, people working in shipyards, because again, the folks down at Electric Boat, the Department of Defense deemed them critical infrastructure, and they had to show up for work in very tight quarters. They've done a good job, in terms of kind of getting that safer with face coverings and shift changes, et cetera. But the point is it has a fund that recognizes these essential workers and gives them $13 an hour for the time that they came to work with a cap of $10,000. I have a thank you sign out in my front yard. Thank you, healthcare workers. I know they're everywhere across the district, which is wonderful. It shows people really appreciate it. We need to do more than that. We need to really recognize that these people put themselves at risk in March and April, and again, did not get any enhanced benefits like the people who were told to stay home and lost income. Yeah. But we need to recognize that, and that's what the Heroes Fund does. There's also more help for agriculture because our farmers in Eastern Connecticut, the dairy guys and the specialty crops have taken a huge hit in terms of the reduction in commodity prices. And there's a direct payments program to help with them. We've had 2 Zoom calls with the Connecticut Farm Bureau, which again has been a lot of Eastern Connecticut farms, family farms that are on there right now. They are really on the edge in terms of loss of revenue, and you hate seeing the spilled milk, which is which is happening because again, school lunch programs came to a halt in terms of the school milk, the milk that was sold to schools, restaurants, and that whole end of the food distribution system also seized up. So again, this bill, in my opinion, addresses exactly what the Federal Reserve Chairman was saying, is that this hit on our economy is going to take a while to recover from, and we should not slow down the recovery by, again, putting state and local government behind the 8 ball and putting a lot of businesses like in the agricultural community, in a tougher spot than we have to. And again, it's time limited. This is not recurring borrowing. And when you get the Federal Reserve saying, you know what, it's okay to do this, to spend this money, because you're never going to get better insurance rates. I mean, the carrying costs, the borrowing costs are almost zero in terms of the fund that we're talking about here. Now's the time to exercise this opportunity to keep the economy as strong as possible for a recovery. Mitch McConnell and the president are basically doing the Herbert Hoover thing by saying, well, we got to pause. We got to sort of see what's going on. The unemployment claims last week were 3 million. That's not pausing. Families' situation is not pausing. And as the chairman points out, the direction of this country, the trajectory of this country economically is not pausing. We got to step up and help people. It's not going to go, all the way through in the Senate. We know that, but I think it was important to get a marker out there that sort of staked out these key components: state and local financing, recognizing the heroes, helping agriculture, and helping small business, which we didn't talk about, but that's another part of the bill.
Okay, so you're going back to DC next week, right? That's the plan?
Yep.
And what are the prospects of getting that bill passed, or at least the most important things on that bill from your optic getting passed? Do you think that there'll be a good Senate House conference committee that will come up with a bill that you can pass?
So last Friday, after we passed the bill, McConnell actually did finally spit it out that, we're probably going to have to do a 5th bill, which was progress because he was completely being, dismissive up to that point. The Senate's not in next week, but we are going to continue, again, with other work of the Congress, as well as looking at parts of the HEROES Act that maybe we can break out and do sort of, as a surgical sort of legislation. But again, in many respects, the key in terms of fiscal policy and economic policy is the state and local. And I think, what's going to happen is that Republican governors who are facing the same, catastrophic loss of revenue that, governors in the Northeast are experiencing, at some point are going to weigh in and just say, if you care about U.S. Senate races, Mitch McConnell, in places like Iowa and Arizona, places like Maine, all the key races, Florida, et cetera, then you've got to step in and do something here, because the Republicans really are painting themselves with the Herbert Hoover image and brand in terms of just the way that they're blowing this off. And that external pressure, I think, will shake things loose.
Yeah, well, I get the impression that the McConnells, the Trumps, that crowd really wants to put it all behind us. Okay, 100,000 deaths, fine. We're done. We succeeded. Great job. Let's open up. So by November, you'll be electing us back. And I think that's the push. That's the sense I get. And then we have more thoughtful people like you, like our governors, like the other governors of states who know that it's a long haul. We have to start gradually. We have to start in stages. There may be another outbreak in the fall, as the scientists are telling us. So do you get that feeling too? We're almost like two separate countries again, where some people are politicizing it. If you want to reopen right away, you are in one camp. And if you really want to be thoughtful and follow the science and do it in stages, and like the hairdressers in Connecticut said, you know what, we're not ready to go yet to open up. And the governor said, okay, I get it. I accept that. Well, you'll open later. Do you sense that too, Joe, that there is this tremendous, on the part of Trump, politicization of this whole issue?
I mean, you could see it last week when we voted on the HEROES Act, that, again, the fault lines were in full display. I mean, Peter King from Long Island was the only Republican who stepped forward. And again, he just basically just said, we're not going to have a New York State government if we don't step up and vote for this bill. And I don't like other parts of it, but, we got to do this. We have had some Republican governors, but, they're in places that you would expect, like Maryland and Massachusetts, who have stepped forward and said, this is critical to do. And I obviously keep quoting Chairman Powell because he's a Trump appointee at the Federal Reserve. I actually think, though, his opinion carries a heck of a lot more weight, because the business community listens to him as well, in terms of, nobody has better economic data than the Federal Reserve, as you know. I mean, they've got the regional offices that are looking around the corner in terms of what's going on. And if you look at the past bills, again, there was a lot of foot dragging and resistance, to those initial bills, which did have some fund, which had funding for hospitals, which the Republicans did, oppose. There was funding for, family leave provision and sick leave, which, again, they hate that stuff. But they realized that, again, in those instances, the public health requirement to get people out of, densely populated workplaces was more important than, than their ideological resistance to that. So, I mean, you posed the question perfectly, Sheila. I mean, is that sort of dual reality of, let's just kind of, move on, nothing to see here, reopen the economy, or whether or not, what I think is driven by the science and also good economic analysis from people like the Federal Reserve prevails, which I think would force some version of the HEROES Act through. And we'll see. I mean, I think that's kind of the next step. Next week, again, the Senate is not in. Okay. So, but they come in the week after that. And, there was a couple of them being quoted that, we'll see what things look like, when we get back in town. And I think it's not going to look much better. I think those unemployment claims are still going to be sky high. And, the need for some replacement of lost revenue for states and local government. And again, that doesn't make distinctions between red districts, red states, and blue states and blue districts.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about our area. Let's talk about Eastern Connecticut, your constituents, your businesses, and the people that are under your leadership.
Yeah.
We know from what we hear from the governor and what I hear from my first selectman, Mary Bailone, that the peak of cases in our area is not really coming until maybe mid-June. So where are we? How are we doing in terms of testing, in terms of hospitalizations, in terms of the number of deaths that we have so far? Give us the lay of the land on that.
So, clearly, when Fairfield County was really taking the biggest hit back in April, which was obviously kind of a ripple effect from New York City, it appeared that the positive cases had not migrated across the Connecticut River, basically, and that we had really extraordinarily low numbers, not just of positive cases, because again, the testing was so limited that probably was not much of an accurate indicator, but really the low number of hospitalizations, which we would have seen, signs of it, regardless of the low test taking at that point. And again, if you look at Bacchus Hospital and L&M, Day Kimball, Wyndham, really it was, relatively speaking, almost handfuls of patients. I give the people in Eastern Connecticut great credit, is that they were not distracted by the fact that those numbers appeared to be less severe than other parts of the state. People really did exercise social distancing and shelter in place, and we're listening to certainly the governor's team as far as whether or not the wave is really kind of maxed out, and whether we're really sort of even in a better position than was projected, even compared to what your first selectwoman was saying. And again, the key is just as we talked about earlier, is just getting that testing capacity out to Eastern Connecticut as strong as possible. Like I mentioned earlier, the shipyard down at EB had to stay open because of a DOD order. So did Pratt and Whitney, Sikorsky, every other shipyard in the country. I was talking to the CEO earlier this week. They did institute a testing procedure at EB. They actually did pretty much the whole Groton metal trades workforce, which was about 4,800 folks that were tested really just up to a couple of days ago. And they only determined 2 positive cases out of that 4,800. They did tracing. They actually kind of backtrack with, where were you exposed to anyone? And it turns out they were exposed to from people that they visited in a hospital completely outside of the shipyard, or another family member. And to me, that story tells why testing and tracing is just so important in terms of whether or not, a region or a state or a country is really, making real success. And I think what the EB testing showed was that they really had showed tremendous progress from where they were compared to, end of March, where they had about 30 cases, including the CEO of the shipyard. Most of those folks are back at work right now, thank God. I mean, their symptoms were relatively mild, apparently. But I think if you were asking what's the biggest challenge in Eastern Connecticut, it's the tourism, hospitality, and casino sector, which again, it makes its money off of density. When the casinos have their best, months of revenue, it's when the place is packed. And the same is true, down in Mystic, the summertime traffic, is bumper to bumper, and you've got, to wait for a table at the great restaurants that are down there right now. That's really where I think, this airborne pathogen is really the most challenging in terms of how do you do this safely. I think the governor, had a tough call to make in terms of whether outdoor dining versus indoor dining, should be the step, or where they should just go straight into indoor dining, which again, some of the folks in the restaurant sector, including Gino Oriema, were pushing for. Again, I think he made the right call that, let's start with outdoor dining, and maybe later in June, move towards indoor dining. But again, it's not going to look like a regular restaurant. You're going to have people sitting, 6 feet apart at different tables, and you're going to have masks on the stewardess, or the waitresses and waiters, and et cetera. So, and the casino, I was talking to the folks at Mohegan. They have invested some pretty serious money in terms of plexiglass, and they're recognizing 15% capacity, 20% capacity when the time comes for them to reopen. Again, all that adds up to the fact that we're going to have a lot of people still out of work in southeastern Connecticut, even once these facilities begin to open. And that's why, again, the HEROES Act, which continues to have some extended unemployment benefits for people who've exhausted the first round, is necessary if we want to keep people in their houses and paying bills, and ready to pivot to go back to work when the time comes. But again, that sort of hospitality tourism sector which is really a big piece of southeastern Connecticut, is really going to have a very challenging time in terms of trying to balance when it's safe to really get full operations.
Yeah, Yeah, and what about the small businesses? They've been getting some help under the bills,
Yeah,
certain grants and loans and things like that. But if they don't get the customers, people don't feel comfortable going out. And a lot of the tourism is based on the small businesses down in the Mystic area and so
right.
forth. Do you envision that some of the small businesses in Eastern Connecticut will just not be able to make it? I mean, do you
Well,
sense that?
yeah, no, I mean, that's a great, I mean, that's a really question of the day sort of situation. Again, the PPP program, the Paycheck Protection Program, which was part of the CARES Act, again, was implemented very aggressively in Eastern Connecticut. I've been talking to the folks over at Chelsea Groton Bank, who I think they did about 600 or 700 loans, there may be even more. And they calculate they saved about 6,000, 7,000 jobs from that effort. And again, that's just one institution because the PPP program was funneled through individual banks as well. So, again, the problem with the PPP program, though, is that the forgivable loan costs were really from 8 weeks to the day you received your loan. For some folks who got into the program early, that's about to expire, and they are not, in many instances, particularly in the restaurant sector, in any position to rehire people because they're just going to sit. I mean, they've got no work to do because the restaurants aren't open. So the HEROES Act, which I know I keep going back to that, but it's important, pushed back that 8-week window to 24 weeks, really to the end of the calendar year, roughly for businesses. And that's a much more manageable program now for restaurants so that they don't feel like they're pressured to have to exhaust those funds at a time period where they're really not in business. And put in some more flexibilities besides that. And again, because we heard a lot from the small businesses that are out there. But to your point, Sheila, this when you lose all your revenue in a small business, and you don't have big cash reserves, you're not some big corporation that's out there right now. It's hard to imagine that there's not going to be some instances where some firms and businesses go out. And again, I mentioned Gino Oriema. It was in the newspaper this morning or yesterday that his restaurant up at Storrs Center in the center of Mansfield, which I've eaten at a number of times, the food is fantastic. He's closing. I mean, he apparently made the decision. Yeah, you may have gone there to maybe go see one of the women's games or something out there, but he opened a new restaurant in Manchester, the old Cavies. But in any case, like I said, I think the CARES Act and the first one and the PPP program was again an extraordinary effort to get resources out in a way that had never been done before. And I give a lot of the banks credit because they processed these loans at a rate that, in fact, forced the money ran out ahead of schedule, and we had to replenish the account at the end of April. There was another disaster loan program which we also authorized for SBA, which frankly has been very poorly run, and that's another reason why we need a 9/11 commission and oversight, because there are companies in our town hall last night who applied for the disaster loan program, which is different than PPP, and has still to this day never gotten a response from them, and we're calling them from our office, and the regional offices and the local offices in Hartford for SBA, frankly, are basically telling us, well, you really have to go up to Washington to get any answers on this. And, that's happening from districts and states all over the country. So you can imagine what that's like.
Wow. So, yeah, so we've talked most of the time, of course, about the issue of the day, which is how do we get out of this coronavirus? What are the federal programs that we need? What's happening on the local level? That's what we're concentrating on. But, the world goes on, and we still are living in a country where the president is trying to get rid of Obamacare and destroy the Affordable Care Act, which is before the Supreme Court. We live in a country where every measure of regulations that help businesses not pollute and so forth is being stripped away. So there are no controls. We live in a country, as I said, where climate change doesn't exist for some people. We live in a country where every oversight of the administration is being stripped away by the president firing anybody who might dare to look into anything that he or his administration have done. So these are issues that are sitting there as well, that are hot button issues that, we have to think about. And we have an election coming up in November. I know you're running again for Congress for your, is it your eighth session this time? I think so. So talk about that, how we need to have a change of administration, and how are we going to be voting in November? And what are the issues? How are we going to make this change? Because if we continue going as we will, the country as you and I know it and the values that you and I think are important are going to be lost.
Well, again, we always say, the election, is the most important election in our lifetime. I mean, how many times have we used that phrase? But frankly, Sheila, it's hard to imagine more at stake than 2020. And again, I tip my hat to you. You did a nice job of sort of posing, really what's on the ballot. That again are even outside the scope of the COVID crisis and pandemic, and the administration's really slapdash response to this threat. And again, we have to do our best to remind people of this administration, and the fact that even in the middle of a pandemic, it is still before the Supreme Court trying to dismantle the Affordable Care Act, which would, if the court, God forbid, goes that route, we're talking about over 20 million people losing their health insurance in the blink of an eye, which again is really the exact opposite of what this country needs in terms of having comprehensive access to health care to control something that affects every single one of us, even those who do have insurance. And the environmental challenge that this administration represents in terms of dismantling fuel efficiency standards, that again means that our ground transportation will be still polluting at a higher rate than the technology warrants. Authorizing the use of methane in emissions, which is poison. I mean, that's not even a climate change issue. That's just a threat to people's physical health that's out there right now. Again, the list goes on and on in terms of what's on the ballot. And the choice is clear. We know this is going to be a close race in terms of the polls. I mean, Joe Biden is up in some of the latest ones, but again, these are very narrow margins that we're talking about. And we're going to be looking at an election with a still unresolved pandemic hanging over us. Again, the predictions of a second wave of infections, during flu season, which coincides with the November election, is not now hopefully treated as just a wild-eyed theory. I mean, it's real, and we know that in terms of the almost 100,000 people we've lost in this country, and how we run an election in the context of that, in many respects, is a huge issue before us. The CARES Act, we actually did allocate some funding for state election offices. It was about $400 million. Connecticut got about $5 or $6 million. And we're seeing the Secretary of the State, Denise Merrill, implement that with enhanced mail-in voting. Again, for the August primary, everyone's going to get an application for an absentee ballot who is a registered Democrat and Republican. And we think that that's, in my personal opinion, that's the right model, is that we just got to give people the option to vote by mail, so that they can, still participate in a way that they feel safe and comfortable with. By the way, we also need to fund the post office, and that's in the HEROES Act. There's $25 billion to bolster their finances. Obviously, you can't have a mail-in election if you don't have a functioning post office.
Just as an aside, Joe,
yeah.
It's very important. Years ago, the Republicans in the Congress passed a bill that really crippled the post office and what they did about funding their pensions. And they gave them a lot of debt because of that. And I think they are on a program to destroy the post office as we know it as a federal agency. They want to privatize it. And just recently, I learned that Trump named someone new to head the post office who is just kind of a crony, someone who doesn't really have the experience, doesn't really care. I'm very worried about that. Are you as worried about that as well? And what are the chances that there will be privatization of the post office, which is goes back to the Paul Revere days of getting on that horse and getting the message out?
Actually, the post office is mentioned in the Constitution,
right?
Because our founders recognized the importance of it. And really, again, even just during the this crisis, the importance of the post office in terms of getting people their emergency income payments, the $1,200 checks, the unemployment benefits, the unemployment note, all that stuff has gone out by mail. I mean, all of the rescue efforts for our country hinges on having a functioning post office. And what I would say, Sheila, is the president is really. We tried in the first CARES Act to get some funding for the post office, and I mean, vehemently opposed it. They also have the ability to borrow money, but again, he's put conditions on it that they have to raise stamp prices by a factor of 4 before he would approve any kind of lending. And again, so the HEROES Act also strips him of those the ability to put those conditions on any financing for the post office. Frankly, this is a real sort of perils of Pauline moment for the post office, because again, the timing of its financial sort of crisis hits in the fall, which is really coincides with the election and coincides with the ability to have a functioning absentee mail-in system here. So again, that's why that funding that's in the HEROES Act is so important. And it still remains to be seen, whether or not we're going to be successful in that effort. But again, to go back to your question about the 2020 election, how we campaign is also a real unique, unprecedented challenge. Obviously, social media is a great tool, but it's not really enough by itself. I mean, that there's populations that still don't really use Facebook and don't use Instagram.
Right.
So
do you
again,
think that the television media, the cable TV channels, should give free media, should give a break because of the conditions?
I mean, I've always felt that.
Conditions.
I've always felt that. I mean, I think you look at European democracies. They view the airwaves as a public asset that should be open to the political system and to our democracy. And it's a challenge. I mean, so anyway, just to really share with you, I mean, everybody is really, trying to figure out really how do we do this? And that includes the Trump campaign, that includes the Biden campaign, both national parties, members of Congress and people running for office. And because really door-to-door campaigning, which, you and I have been doing that forever, people are not going to be too excited about opening their door to
Right,
who they don't know. And I don't think many people are going to be too interested in going door to door. And so, even lit drops and trying to do phone banks, getting people to come to campaign headquarters, all of this stuff is really, which have been, kind of just a given in terms of
right.
campaigns.
Well, there'll still be debates, won't there? The television stations will sponsor debates.
Yeah,
So maybe the League of Women Voters will sponsor debates, and those will be televised. Right?
Yes and no. I mean, Trump is actually there's been talk that he may refuse to debate.
I can see that happening. Yeah.
So, and again, once you get down from presidential levels, the number of people who actually really watch debates for down ticket is really actually quite limited. So it's anyway. I mean, it's another one of these works in progress in terms of just how it all evolves.
And it's sad. It's sad to contemplate that it seems like Trump and the Republicans are doing everything possible to stop the prospect of more states having mail-in voting. They fear that more people being able to mail in their votes will hurt them. They always fear that the more people will vote will hurt them. And whether that's actually true or not, I don't really know. But you're going to have that fight, aren't you?
No, it is. It's true. And again, of course, the president voted by mail in Florida, where's his new residence. But the good news is that, even despite all of those, willful obstacles that are trying to get thrown up to block ballot access, if you look at the turnout in the primaries up until the point when, they pretty much have come to a halt, even in Wisconsin, where, again, the Republicans blocked, with the help of the Wisconsin Supreme Court, an expanded mail-in effort, which the governor tried to implement out there, they still broke records in terms of people showing up and voting. And that's consistent with what happened in 2018 when we had the largest voter turnout for a midterm election since 1914. And that, to me, that's the one thing that, gives me solace, is that despite all of these challenges and the fact that, there's no question Trump will outspend Biden in this race. And if you look at the financial reports of the two camps, overwhelming advantage that's there. This country, I think, frankly, is about as energized and politicized, and that's not all bad. That I think, that is going to force a big number of people to show up and turn out or mail in ballots this fall. And that's, but we've obviously got to make sure we do everything we can because this election, as you point out, the consequences, will last for generations to come.
So it's been great having you on. Is there anything else? I want you to give us a closing comment. Maybe it'll be uplifting. Maybe it'll be hopeful. Something that's on your chest, something you want to get out to finish. And thank you, everybody, for watching. Joe is always available to talk to you, to go on his website, to ask questions, to figure out how you can access the programs that the federal government has that his office can help you with. So we'll see you next time on Talk Back, but now let's Joe have the final word.
Sure. So, well, thank you again, Sheila. And, these, again, are these opportunities and outlets that we have to capitalize on at a time like this, and to the folks at the cable station for hosting it. What I would say is, number one, we are still, despite all of the negativity and turnoffs that people feel about our political process, the turnout numbers this year really, I think, are still very encouraging and really almost inspiring in terms of the fact that, the connection people make between the fact that, elections matter and your vote counts, and the result of all that, I think is pretty crystal clear with folks. And, I would say that even though, as you point out, there's sort of two camps that are starting to really form out there, I also point out that the shared reality of what we've been going through in terms of the coronavirus has brought together people in an impressive way that sort of rises above some of that polarization that still is, again, a big part of the state of mind of this country right now. And I do think that, particularly those folks who have been out there treating patients, bringing patients forward, there's something that shared experience is really also, I think, the secret sauce in terms of how we get out of this situation that we're in right now, in terms of the bubbles that people are living in. And that shared reality, has had some really good response, and hopefully it will also have a good lesson that we learn in terms of this country moving forward and getting past this challenging area that time that we're living in, that we just spent an hour or so talking about. So as Sheila said, our office is open. It is somewhat remotely open, but we are getting more calls and emails than ever before, and we want to continue to engage with people directly with individual issues as well as with telephone town halls, which again, we've shattered all records in terms of turnout. It's a great district, and it's still, I think, a great country. And but obviously, we've got a lot of work to do over the next 5 months. Thanks, Sheila.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks for giving us the last word. Yeah. And this is Talk Back. See you next time. Bye.
Yeah. That wasn't so bad.